Now, the distinctive form of argument is a transcendental argument. Now, that is an argument that is trying to demonstrate or provide a proof as to what allows you to use, what justifies your use of induction or pragmatic argument or a abductive argument, or in a sense even justifying logic in itself. It's trying to provide some sort of justification as to why you can use those arguments. So it's almost like it's trying to provide because it's not dealing with a specific aspect of nature. It's dealing with the principle. It's like with a transcendentalist has the advantage that they can then use, say, an inductive argument, or they can then use, or they've legitimized, provided some sort of justification for logic. Because some people argue against logic by just saying, well, logic's just arbitrary, it's just socially defined in some way, we just find it useful, it's axiomatic, we just come with these axioms, they're useful to us, they solve problems, therefore we're going to use them. Whereas the transcendentalist is trying to tie with their metaphysics, is actually saying, no, this is the way reality really is. And so a transcendentalist has the advantage that they can use deductive arguments, they can use inductive arguments, they can even use have pragmatic considerations in there. And so that's all I'm trying to do here is to introduce those terms, those major terms, those major concepts of proof, to help you understand that except for the deductive mode, there's fallibility built in. So there's fallibility built into induction, there's fallibility built into the pragmatic approach. The fallibility is built into that, and with the deductive, on the face of it, it's a much stronger form of argumentation, because you're saying that your conclusion follows from your premises, and unless you invalidate the premises, your conclusion's solid, it's firm. But you then have the problem, which is the problem that of how do you provide some sort of rationale, some sort of justification for logic, because you can't go into nature and say, I found logic in nature. And so the transcendentalist is actually dealing with that problem. They're not just sort of saying, well, we're going to assume that logic. Is that logic useful to us? Which is what a pragmatist would say. But they're trying to provide some sort of justification. So the transcendentalist, in a sense, has got a much bigger epistemological toolbox, because they can coherently use, say, deductive arguments, they can coherently use inductive arguments, they can coherently use pragmatic arguments. They can use those because they've got some sort of justification for why induction, say, is a legitimate principle, why is deduction a legitimate process. There's some sort of justification there, because one of the big moves in, say, 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, one of the great moves in philosophy was saying, well, actually, no, there is no justification for those things. They're all socially constructed. They're all arbitrary. We just pick and choose. It's relativistic, and in literature, the deconstructionists were saying absolutely there's no reference to any of our language, that it's all totally arbitrary. The death of the author, when which is very ironic, because you have to read their work to get to the conclusion to say, there is no resident meaning in my work. But you can see how the transcendental approach is 100% opposed to the deconstructionist approach. It's actually saying, well, let's answer these big, tough questions as to why if we assume, why is logic, what does it say about the universe if logic, what is it saying about reality? Why can we use induction, or why can we use deduction? Why can we ask these questions? And so that is the, what provides, what are we assuming about the world? There's something, there's truth, there's reality, there's some sort of interconnection between why do things behave the way they do. And so the transcendentalist is interested in that question, and is really interested in providing some sort of intellectual coherence to your philosophy. And it's not just, say, intellectual coherence, because Leibniz and Spinoza are known for having a coherent philosophy, but there was no way those philosophies could be tied into the real world. So that's the interesting thing about, say, the second aspect of, say, transcendentalism, is that it wants to know how do we tie this in to the real world, because we looked at verification previously, and we said that was an attempt to tie in and to construct a theory of knowledge and a theory of meaning, and it was trying to tie in to the physical world. But we then found that it was the verification principle itself. There was no justification for the verification principle that provided this tying in. And so the transcendental question is how would you justify a verification principle? Is it possible to justify a verification principle on a transcendental basis? Which is that's an area of research. That's almost where I finished my research, was saying this is a proposed solution to the problem of the verification principle, is that it can be justified on a transcendental basis. And I never actually evaluated to any degree that assertion that the transcendental principle could be justified. Can't be justified on an empirical basis, but can it be justified on a transcendental basis? So when you're asking transcendental questions, you're asking questions about what legitimizes your question. What are you assuming? What you're bringing to it? Kant's famous discussion of the transcendental method was what do we have to assume about objects to make the objects of knowledge possible at all? And so that's why he's considered the father of the transcendentalist approach, the critique of pure reason. He was trying, it says, the transcendental deduction of the different categories of the human understanding. And so he was trying to say there was some fundamental things in our psychology and our understanding that we always bring to the world, and we then remake the world according to these categories. That's the most controversial aspect of his, because he was saying that the mind is then constitutive of reality. The mind is creating the objects of reality, whereas the realist view is always very much the world is out there and we're in contact with the objects of those world directly. They're not mediated to us by, we're not cut off from reality by the processes of the mind. So the modern transcendentalists, which is generally considered to be anybody who followed Strawson in 1959 wrote a book on it. He was called Descriptive Individuals, I think he called it, and an essay in descriptive metaphysics. And he's generally considered to be, going to get a bit hoarse here. He was what was known as a neo-Kantian. So he was saying that when you consider Kant's psychologism, he considered that to be unsafe. And I think most neo-Kantians, that's their starting point. They would not be convinced. They're convinced by Kant's question. And the interesting thing is, in my research, is that Van Til said that Kant was asking the right question, but his use of the psychological apparatus of the categories to provide some sort of transcendental for human knowledge, they would say that's weak and unsafe, because you're assuming that all human beings think in the same way, that all human beings have got this sort of conceptual apparatus that they then bring, and that, and most neo-Kantians would reject that sort of psychological aspect, but they are still saying that the question that he was asking, the transcendental nature of, when you analyse, when we, I'll talk about Strawson at some point, Strawson's arguments, in some detail, to try and show that Strawson was interested in the ability of a transcendental mode of argumentation to overcome the problem of scepticism, and he said that when somebody tries to generate, say, a skeptical argument over, say, can I try this? He was saying that one of the assumptions of, say, one of the arguments, it's one of the most famous arguments, I think, in his book, where he was saying, he said, there's no doubt that we all assume that there is a spatial temporal world of objects out there, and that those objects are persisting through time. And that's an elaborate way of saying that we are assuming that, he said, there's no doubt about it in our experience of the world, just in order for us to make sense of reality, and we assume that there's a world that is external to us, and that it's got objects in there, and that those objects persist in time. So imagine you go to bed, because he was saying that, say, a hard-going skeptic might say this, you go to bed at night and you look at the alarm clock, and you turn over and you want to go to sleep. And so a thoroughgoing skeptic might say, how do you know that alarm clock, when you wake up the next day, because you weren't looking at that alarm clock and you're awake all night, how do you know that alarm clock that is there is the same alarm clock that was there when you went to bed? How do you know that somebody is not come in the middle of the night and changed the alarm clock with one that looks just like it, or taken or changed all the furniture in your room? It looks just like the same furniture you had. How can you show that that's not true? And so, on the face of it, you can't. So that's what a skeptic would say. Well, no, you can't. We can't be certain about it, because you can't say that that's not a realistic scenario. And so, but what Strawson tries to do, what he does is that he says, right, okay, you've got those individual. The transcendental question is not about is that a legitimate scenario that somebody could come in and change my alarm clock, change my furniture? And you can say, yes, you can say, yes, that could have possibly happened, but he's saying that's not really the question we're interested in here. He's saying the transcendental question is that the transcendental question is the question of whether those objects are persisting through time, external to our perception of them. Okay, because Berkeley, if you've studied Bishop Berkeley at all, one of the early empiricists, who was also, unusually for an empiricist, he was also an idealist, and he said that it's only when an object is perceived that it's real. And so he was saying that unless an object is perceived in our perception, they don't really exist, which he was trying to deal with the question of materialism. And so he was saying that the best way to deal with the problem of materialism, because people are attacking Christianity through materialism, was to actually get rid of materialism in its time, the material world in its entirety. A very bold, dramatic, but it was interesting because he was an empiricist, but he was an idealist, so he believed that reality, objects, only existed when they were perceived. And so with Strawson, sort of like, in a sense, coming back to this question, he was saying that the transcendental question is the persistence of those objects through time when I'm not looking at them, outside, i.e. separate from my perception of them. And so he's actually saying that if you try and argue, and it might be worth sort of like in detail sort of picking through that argument at some point, but he was saying that your attempt it's easy to see the individual case that it's possible, yes, somebody could have swapped my stuff out, but consider the general case. What the transcendental question is that when we go to bed at night, consider the population as a whole. When the population as a whole go to bed at night, and they've got an alarm clock in there and they've got some big furniture, when they wake up in the morning, they, as far as they can tell, all the furniture is the same, their bed is the same, their pajamas are the same, everything's the same. And he was saying that to try and come up with a general argument that says that we cannot conclude that there is persistence of objects without us, outside of our perception of them, that there, i.e. there's actually a real external physical world of objects out there. He said that in order to try and use and generalize that case of the individual objects, that case of the individual being able to have all their stuff swapped and your alarm clock's not the same alarm clock, he said the problem is you've already assumed the concept of an alarm clock, you've already assumed the concept of furniture, you've already assumed the concept that of a room with particular things in a particular relation to each other. And so he's saying that your skepticism about whether or not anyone can if you're trying to come up with a general skeptical argument of saying because in the individual situation you can't give me a convincing argument that says that you know that's not the particular alarm clock, you know that's not your particular piece of furniture, that it's not your particular chair, there, because you can't show to me, because you weren't awake all night watching those, that they weren't changed. Because he's saying that even if you are asleep, and you've got no direct perception of that, you are still assuming when you're trying to come up with that, trying to generalize that particular argument, that particular case of where you have to say yes, you have to admit and say yes, well, somebody could have come in my room and changed them all with stuff that looked exactly like the same. But he was saying if you try and move that then into a general metaphysical statement about this is the way the whole of reality is, and this is why we can't be certain about anything, is because we can have these individual examples in nature that are skeptically vulnerable to being refuted by particular instances, are vulnerable to skepticism. He say, but you can't generalize. The only way you can generalize that skepticism into a general skepticism about the whole of the world and about the whole of nature, and that we can't be certain of anything, is by assuming the things that our skepticism has tried to refute. And that's a very, very powerful form of argumentation. So he's trying to say that the transcendental argument provides a justification, and in a sense it actually shows that it's one of its most powerful features is its ability to overcome skeptical doubts. And that's in the since that sort of like period at I think he published in 1959, most of the discussion in the literature about transcendental arguments, why they was their ability to overcome skeptical conclusions by demonstrating that only by assuming what your skeptical conclusion is trying to demonstrate, that these things aren't what you're concluding, your skeptical conclusions, what you're assuming about reality, you're already assuming those in order to generate your skeptical argument. Plantinga called that the scandalous skepticism. You know, if you come to conclusions that say, I can't trust the I can't trust what I see because I've proved that particular instances of my seeing are not accurate, and therefore none of my, you're making an inductive generalization there, aren't you? You're going from the general, from the specific to the general. And so, but you're not warranted to do that because subsequent empirical observations can correct your error. And so it's trying to show that, say, skepticism is internally inconsistent. So the transcendental mode of argument, one of its most powerful features, is to show that the skeptic, in order to try and generate their argument, is assuming their position of the non-skeptic to generate their skeptical conclusion, and therefore they are incoherent. They're having to assume what the non-skeptic, the assumptions of the non-skeptic, in order to generate their conclusion. So it's a very sort of powerful thought. So it's not just that, say, it's not talking about specific instances. That's the thing with transcendental arguments, is that they're not talking about specific instances. They're talking about something that's much broader, so a concept. With Strawson, he was talking about the persistence of material objects with time, and he was saying you can't get into a discussion about the persistence of objects in time without assuming something about, you're assuming what you're talking about. You've got the concept of object, you've got the concept of persistence, you've got the concept of passing of time. You can't come to a skeptical conclusion without using those concepts. You're already assuming those concepts in your argument. So that's the power of the transcendental approach, is that you're demonstrating, when you're already using those things, you're trying to tell me are false. But it's not talking about, say, a specific instance in nature, because we can see there that yes, you've got this specific. It's talking about, because you can swap, have all the furniture swapped out of your room. Somebody can swap your alarm clock. Somebody can, you couldn't necessarily prove that that hadn't happened, but that doesn't invalidate your belief in the persistence of objects without you seeing them. So that's what Strawson was. That it was a principle. And other philosophers, particularly, say, in the Oxford school, they're saying that, say, if you use, say, a concept of, say, good or of truth, those have no. If in fact, it's better to consider it in a negative way. If you consider the concept of bad or of evil, that makes no sense to talk, or being correct, or being that makes no talk, it makes no sense to talk about those concepts without having, say, the concept of good, correct, true. Yeah, those concepts in themselves are assuming those other concepts. You're always, if you're trying to argue for, say, the correctness of a view, that means that you have a concept of error. You do have a concept of correctness. So it's trying to say that it makes no sense to argue that nothing can be known without that conclusion would be considered incoherent, because you are assuming that it is possible to. You must have some sort of concept of what it means to be known if you're trying to conclude that nothing can be known. If you've never heard that before, it might be difficult to understand that. you're actually saying, so if somebody's concluding by their elaborate argument, and this has been the history of philosophy in the latter part of the 20th century, is that there was great enthusiasm for what people might call, say like a postmodern critique of modernism, but the idea of, say, if your conclusion is trying to tell you that we cannot be certain about anything, the transcendentalist would come in and say, wait a minute, you're saying we cannot be certain about anything, but in order for you to generate that conclusion, you must have the concept of certainty within your structure, within your noetic structure. You must have. It makes no sense to say I cannot be certain about anything unless you have the concept of certainty. And you're saying, if you cannot have the unless you already have that concept of certainty, you cannot generate your skeptical conclusion. And so that's the power of the transcendental critique, because you're saying, well, you're being incoherent in arguing to your skeptical conclusion, because you're assuming you're using the concept of certainty that your conclusion saying it's not possible for you to use. That's a powerful argument. So that's one of the that, I suppose, is that in brief the power of the transcendental mode of argument, is because one of its most useful and powerful elements is this sort of ability to challenge that sort of skeptical view. Got the sun just streaming in from around the corner there. And so I think that's a great point to finish on, is that sort of like that the wonderful promise, in the sense of transcendental argumentation, is it's the transcendental principle of sort of looking back and saying, right, what are you assuming when you're what are you assuming in order to make sense of reality at all? And somebody who's, say, like a skeptic is also, when you subject what their mode of argumentation, you're not arguing about a specific fact of nature, you're arguing about a principle within nature. And that's one of the things that Kant describes, that the transcendental, the principle, when you end up with a transcendental statement or some sort of transcendental deduction, what you're actually saying is that you are having to assume, even in your own argument, you are assuming that transcendental in order to construct that transcendental argument. So it's like you're already assuming that it makes it possible. That's the formal way of saying it, is that it makes possible its own ground from proof. So that you can never escape the transcendental principle. It's assumed in even formulating your transcendental principle, and that in a sense is almost like that sounds really complicated when you put it that way, but it's a bit like saying, when you're writing a letter to somebody, you're always assuming within that you're going to have to assume certain laws of grammar, principles of grammar, and so you can't escape that. And so when you're formulating, say, like an argument, you can never escape certain basic things, certain transcendentals, which allow you to do that in the first place. And so this is one of the things that, as I progress through my work, I'm trying to say that those presuppositions of knowledge, those things that you assume as presuppositions, that's when transcendentalism is so helpful to you, is because you're analysing and you're demonstrating to somebody that that even though they might be, in the particular, when it gets to the end of my work, what I'm actually trying, when I try and say, once I've sort of like climbed up this big philosophical ladder, and I'm saying, right, how does this affect, say, our relationship to God, or our concept of God? How are we doing? How does God fit into this process? Why? And the God, in a sense, becomes the transcendental that guarantees all the other transcendentals of nature.